Greece is about to collapse. Over the last decade, Greece has lost more than 300,000 people, a 3% drop in its population. Here on this chart, you can see that the country could lose a quarter of its people by 2050, leaving just 7.5 million inhabitants of the now 10.5 million population. This means that nearly 40% of the population is expected to be over the age of 65, becoming one of the countries with the oldest populations in the world. So, with this aging population, the workforce has been shrinking rapidly. With fewer young people entering the labor market, Greece faces declining productivity and tax revenues, which translates to a weaker economy. At the same time, the aging population places immense pressure on the pension and healthcare systems. Greece already spends a higher percentage of its GDP on pensions than any other EU country, a staggering 17.5% in 2021. As the elderly population grows, these costs will become even more unsustainable. What makes this even worse is the financial situation in Greece. The European Union had to bail the country out of its debt crisis in 2009, and they'll probably need to bail them out again soon. In this video, we'll go over how serious this problem really is. So, Greece's demographic collapse has gone from a social worry to a government emergency, as the population decline now begins to affect everything throughout the nation. Nowadays, the demographic decline is a universal issue. But the difference with the demographic issues compared to other countries is that Greece has had them for a tremendously long time. And this population decline didn't start with the Ottoman conquest of Greece or the financial debt crisis. It's a series of catastrophic events starting in the 1940s, a decade that pretty much broke the country. First, there was the Nazi occupation in World War II, which devastated Greece. We're talking mass famine, entire villages wiped out, and infrastructure systematically destroyed. In Athens alone, tens of thousands died of hunger during the brutal winter of 1941 and 42. By the end of the war, Greece had lost about 10% of its population of 7.5 million people. But just when you think things couldn't get worse, they did. The Greek Civil War erupted right after the Nazis left, from 1944 to 1949. This wasn't just a political conflict, it was a brutal catastrophe. Thousands of people were forced to flee their homes, creating a massive displacement crisis. Between 1941 and 1950, the country lost an estimated 840,000 people, counting both those who died and the children who were never born because of the chaos. And then came the Exodus. Greece's post-war economy was in shambles, so the government basically said, we need people to leave. Over 2 million Greeks, about a quarter of the population at the time, immigrated to the West. These people weren't just any people. They were young, educated, and full of potential. The kind of people who could have rebuilt the country. Between 1961 and 1977 alone, over 1 million left for good, and another 1 million left temporarily. This brain drain left Greece with an aging population and fewer people to keep things running. Fast forward to the late 20th century, and things didn't exactly improve. Greece remains relatively poor compared to many European countries, with much lower average incomes and higher reliance on sectors like tourism and agriculture, which are more vulnerable in times like lockdowns. Speaking about lockdowns, the COVID-19 lockdowns hit Greece's economy the hardest after the financial crisis, making things even tougher. The country's GDP took a 9% dive in 2020, and tourism, one of its main moneymakers, got slammed. Revenues from tourism dropped by more than 75%, crashing from 18 billion euro in 2019 to just 4.3 billion in 2020. But before the lockdowns and financial crisis, urbanization was reshaping the country slowly. It pulled people out from rural areas and into cities, where traditional big, multi-generational families were forced to downsize. Fertility rates, once comfortably above replacement levels, started dropping. In 1950, the fertility rate was 2.515 births per woman. However, by the early 2000s, Greece had one of the lowest fertility rates in all of Europe, just 1.3 kids per woman, with over 140,000 births a year. And by 2025, it is projected to be just 1.265 births per woman, one of the lowest in Europe, dropping to just 72,244, the lowest in Greece's modern history. It's almost surreal to think about it. Now, this wasn't the only challenging situation Greece had to deal with. There was something worse that really caused an even more steep decline of the population, and that's the economic earthquake of the 2010s. And trust me, it was as bad as it sounds. The story starts in 2009, when Greece basically pulled the curtain back and revealed that its economy was, well, a complete disaster. Years of overspending, A bloated public sector and some very creative accounting came to light. Turns out Greece's budget deficit wasn't just bad, it was double what they had been saying. Greece's government revealed its budget deficit had exceeded 12% of GDP, well above the European Union's limit of 3%. This raised alarms, both domestically and internationally, leading to a loss of investor confidence and skyrocketing borrowing costs, and suddenly Greece was the poster child for a financial nightmare. This kicked off the infamous Greek debt crisis, and it didn't just shake Greece, it threatened the stability of the entire Eurozone. To keep things from spiraling even further, the EU and the IMF stepped in with bailout packages. Sounds like a good thing, right? Well, not so much. The bailout packages, totaling over 260 billion euro, helped stabilize Greece's finances, but these bailouts came with strings attached. More like steel chains, really. Greece had to implement brutal austerity measures, cutting pensions, raising taxes, slashing public sector jobs. The goal was to, quote-unquote, fix the economy. But it felt more like squeezing an already struggling country for every last drop. While these measures provided short-term stability, they triggered a deep recession, with Greece's GDP shrinking by a quarter between 2008 and 2013, the worst contraction in modern Europe. By 2013, unemployment hit a jaw-dropping 27.5%, the highest in Europe. And for young people, it was even worse. Youth unemployment peaked at 60%. 60%. Imagine being in your 20s, looking for your first job, and realizing that the job market is basically a black hole. So what do people do when they can't find work? Well, they leave. During the crisis years, over 500,000 Greeks packed up and left, many of them highly educated. Doctors, engineers, scientists, they were gone, contributing their skills to places like Germany, the UK, and Australia, instead of their home country. This brain drain was devastating for Greece. These weren't just workers, they were the future, the people who were supposed to rebuild the country. Instead, Greece lost an entire generation of talent, and the ripple effects are still being felt to this day. Public services fell apart. Hospitals ran out of basic supplies, schools shut down, and social welfare programs were slashed to the bone. Meanwhile, taxes kept going up. Property taxes, income taxes, you name it. Wages, on the other hand, were going the opposite direction, sometimes dropping by as much as 40%. People who had been in the middle class were suddenly struggling to pay for essentials like food and electricity. In cities like Athens and Thessaloniki, the cost of living kept climbing, making it nearly impossible for young people to even think about starting families. And here's where things start to spiral even more. With so many people leaving, and so many others delaying or just deciding not to have kids, Greece's population began shrinking even more in the 2020s, dropping from around 10.72 million in 2020 to an estimated 10.44 million in 2023. By 2019, surveys showed that 62% of Greeks said financial instability was the main reason they weren't having children. And who could blame them? Raising a family feels impossible when you're just trying to survive. And this is creating a long-term crisis for Greece, with far-reaching consequences. Fewer people means fewer workers, fewer taxpayers, and fewer customers for businesses, making it nearly impossible for the economy to grow. The knock-on effects are everywhere. Businesses are struggling to fill positions, forcing some to consider leaving the country altogether. Infrastructure projects that could stimulate the economy are being delayed or canceled due to a lack of workers. The government, trapped in a vicious cycle, faces mounting financial pressures. It needs to invest in the economy to reverse these trends, but limited resources and manpower make it nearly impossible. To make matters worse, the brain drain hasn't slowed down. Young, educated Greeks are still leaving in droves, further depleting the country's potential to recover. If current trends continue, it's hard to see how Greece pulls itself out of this downward spiral. So, the overall finances and economy of the country don't look all too exciting. On a family level, it's just the same, because raising a child in Greece today is a financial mountain that many families simply can't climb. And let's not sugarcoat it. The cost of raising a child has skyrocketed to the point where it's practically an economic luxury. People can forget about housing. In recent years, cities like Athens and Thessaloniki have experienced significant increases in housing costs. In Thessaloniki, renters now face an average price of 9.2 euro per square meter, surpassing central Athens, where the average is 8.8 euro per square meter. This surge has led Greeks to allocate a substantial portion of their income to housing. In 2023, they spent 35.2% of their disposable income on housing, the highest in the European Union, where the average was 19.7%. Moreover, 31% of the population is forced to spend over 40% of their disposable income on housing costs, indicating a significant housing cost overburden. Then there's childcare, which is a whole other headache. Public childcare options are limited, and the private ones will drain your wallet even faster. For a lot of parents, especially mothers, this means either cutting back on work or leaving the workforce altogether, which creates a vicious cycle of reduced income and increased stress. And education, the supposed ladder to success, is another financial black hole. Sure, public schools exist, but in Greece, they don't cut it when it comes to preparing kids for the high-stakes university entrance exams. That's where private tutoring, what Greeks call frontisteria, comes in. It's basically a non-negotiable expense if you want your kid to have a shot at a higher education. The cost? Why, thousands of euros per year per child. Add that to the growing list of expenses, and you start to see why young married couples are just not having kids altogether. If you add all of the costs together, you get around 233,000 euro from birth to adulthood. To put that in perspective, the average annual income in Greece is only about 14,000 euro. For many families, these numbers simply don't add up. And it's not just about the money. It's about what the money represents. Security, stability, and the ability to plan for the future. Without those, starting a family feels more like a gamble than a smart decision. This problem is also very similar with the financial burden of the government debt and the pension system. Greece's government has been struggling with debt since decades ago, which still continues to this day. As we discussed before in this video about the crippling debts Greece had to deal with, Greece's debt keeps growing, even after all these painful reforms. It reached 189% of GDP by 2018, the highest ratio in the EU. Despite modest recovery, the country remains trapped in a cycle where servicing this massive debt consumes a significant portion of the government's revenue, limiting its ability to invest in essential services or infrastructure. In 2023, Greece's debt stood at 171.3% of GDP, still one of the highest in the world. The country remains dependent on external financial support, and its debt continues to restrict fiscal flexibility, hindering its long-term economic growth. At the same time, Greece's pension system, once one of the most generous in Europe, has also contributed to the country's economic instability. Before the financial crisis, retirees in Greece received pensions that replaced 80% of their pre-retirement income, far above the EU's average of 60%. This generosity, coupled with an aging population, led to an unsustainable system already under pressure before the 2008 global financial crisis. Funded by a pay-as-you-go model, the system was fine as long as the working population was large enough to support the retirees. But with fewer workers and more retirees, the system started to buckle. And by the time the crisis hit, it was already in a significant deficit. As part of the bailout, pension benefits were slashed by up to 50%. And the retirement age was raised from 65 to 67. The country consolidated its many pension funds into a single entity, but that led to lower payouts for retirees. Despite these painful reforms, the pension system remained underfunded, with many pensions reduced or frozen. As of 2023, Greece spends about 15% of its national budget on pensions, one of the highest rates in the EU. The system's sustainability is at risk, compounded by Greece's low fertility rate, which means fewer working-age citizens are paying into the system. Meanwhile, life expectancy continues to rise, meaning the number of retirees needing support will grow. This has created a pension crisis, with some experts warning the system could collapse without more reform. Pensioners, who now make up a significant portion of Greece's population, are at risk of falling into poverty as their benefits continue to shrink. With 22% of its citizens aged 65 and older, and this figure is expected to rise to 33% by 2050, it is becoming an enormous strain on public finances, as pensions and healthcare expenditures consume a growing share of GDP. In 2021, Greece spent 17.6% of its GDP on social protection, one of the highest rates in the EU, with a significant portion dedicated to age-related expenses. But financial burden is only one part of the broader picture, because on the other side, the cultural shift is undeniably playing a role in the population decline. There was a time, decades ago, when Greece used to revolve around big, tight-knit families. We're talking about homes where multiple generations live together. Parents, grandparents, kids, sometimes even aunts and uncles. Family wasn't just a part of life. It was life, And these weren't just practical arrangements, they were deeply rooted in tradition. Everyone had a role to play, and the family was your safety net, your support system, and your identity. The Greek Orthodox Church was right at the center of all this, shaping values and norms. It encouraged big families, early marriages, and a sense of duty to carry on traditions. Back then, marriage and kids weren't seen as a choice, they were seen as milestones. Fast forward to today, and that version of Greece feels like a different world altogether. The shift started with urbanization. Young people left the villages where these traditions thrived, moving into cities like Athens and Thessaloniki for better education and job opportunities. In these urban centers, life is faster, it's more competitive, and way more individualistic. The old family structures don't fit as easily into this new reality. Living with your parents and grandparents isn't as common when you're crammed into a tiny apartment in the city. And as people's lives became more centered around work and personal goals, the traditional family dynamic starts to fade, and women started to enter the workforce. Marriage is one of the biggest indicators of this shift. Fewer people are getting married, and those who do are waiting longer. The average age for first-time moms in Greece is now 31 and a half, one of the highest in Europe. That's a massive jump from a few decades ago when most people started families by their early 20s. Big families have been replaced by smaller households, with many young Greeks deciding that parenthood just isn't for them. Religion, which used to play a huge role in shaping Greek culture, doesn't have the same influence anymore. For younger generations, religion has taken a backseat. Secularization is a big part of it, and it just keeps being prevalent. Globalization has also played a massive role in changing Greek society. Younger Greeks are exposed to new ideas and new ways of life through social media, pop culture, and travel. There's this overwhelming narrative that your 20s and 30s should be about exploring the world, advancing your career, and building your own life before you even think about settling down. It's not that family is no longer important, it's just not urgent. So the rise of contraception and new attitudes towards family planning has also had a great effect on the choices of couples having fewer kids. They can spend their time together without the worries of raising a child. Hence, contraception became more popular in the 90s in Greece. When you put it all together, urbanization, the decline of religion, changing cultural values, globalization, and financial struggle, you can see how the traditional Greek family structure has just unraveled. And this is how we got to the current demographic crisis. All of this has left Greece with an uphill battle to sustain its economy and care for its aging population. So, where does this leave Greece? Well, in a tough spot, to say the least. If these issues aren't tackled, Greece could face a situation where its economy becomes too weak to recover. The government's debt might grow to unmanageable levels, leading to another crisis, perhaps even a default. Public services would deteriorate further, and the country would struggle to maintain its position within the European Union. At worst, this could result in widespread poverty, social unrest, and the immigration of even more of the country's remaining young talent. If nothing changes, Greece could slowly lose its ability to function as a modern, developed nation. But there might be a solution, since it's not too late. While it's clear there's no magic fix, there are things that could be done to slow the spiral and mitigate the impact. For one, addressing the mindset around family could be crucial. Over decades, Greek society has shifted towards individualism, with marriage and children losing their place as priorities. Changing this trend might not be easy, but efforts could be made to reignite the cultural family of value, community, and generational continuity. The government could potentially help by making family life more appealing again, perhaps through education campaigns that highlight the long-term benefits of raising children, both for families and for the society as a whole. Reframing the role of mothers could also play a key part in this. Those who choose to stay home and raise children could be recognized as valuable contributors to society. And while the government could introduce policies like a national salary for stay-at-home moms, it's clear that small steps might not be enough. But the government can't do this alone. In fact, Greece's economic policies need to be much more comprehensive to address the demographic crisis. Housing subsidies, for example, could alleviate the financial burden of homeownership, one of the biggest deterrents for young families. Despite high homeownership rates, young adults are faced with rising property taxes, stagnant wages, and limited access to affordable mortgages. By offering targeted housing grants or low-income loans for families with children, the government could make homeownership more achievable. Additionally, tax credits for families, progressively increasing with each child, might reduce the financial pressures on parents. For instance, credits worth 5 to 10% of household income per child could go a long way to help offset rising costs in education, food, and healthcare. The high costs of childcare remain a major barrier. In large cities, childcare can eat up as much as 20 to 30% of a family's income, putting a strain on parents who are already struggling to balance work and family life. While providing universal and subsidized childcare could help families manage, it could also boost female labor force participation. With one of the lowest female labor force participation rates in the EU, making childcare more affordable could allow women to re-enter the workforce while also easing the economic pressures that discourage childbearing in the first place. Targeting policies towards women in their 20s and their 30s, when fertility rates are at their highest, could also help stabilize the population. But pro-natalist policies alone won't solve everything. Greece has a huge resource it's not fully tapping into: its diaspora. There are around 4 million Greeks living abroad, spread across countries like the US, Canada, Australia, and various parts of Europe. That's a lot of people, and a lot of potential. If Greece could somehow convince these skilled professionals and entrepreneurs to come back, it could make a huge difference. But there's a catch. Returning to Greece isn't as simple as offering some tax breaks or streamlining the bureaucracy. That's been tried, and the results have been, well, underwhelming, to say the least. A lot of Greeks abroad just don't trust the system. In fact, surveys show that more than 60% of expatriates point to bureaucratic inefficiency and political instability as the main reasons that they don't want to move back. And who can blame them? Greece's job market is stagnating, and despite the incentives, it's hard to see how the country can offer real opportunities. The bureaucracy, nepotism, and general inefficiency makes returning home feel more like a gamble rather than a real chance for success. So even with these attractive tax incentives, there's still this huge barrier. People abroad just don't believe the system works the way it should. Tax breaks sound nice on paper, but if the underlying issues, corruption, inefficient systems, and a lack of opportunity, aren't addressed, it's hard to convince anyone to come back. This isn't a quick fix situation. If Greece wants its diaspora to repopulate the country, they've got to rebuild trust and create an environment where innovation and entrepreneurship can thrive. Creating an environment that attracts people is essential in combating this problem. Same as for the rural areas, where the population decline has left behind ghost towns and empty villages. With over 40% of the population now living in urban centers, addressing this imbalance could help ease the pressure on overcrowded cities and encourage people to repopulate rural areas. While Italy and Japan have attempted similar initiatives, offering homes at low or no cost in exchange for families relocating, Greece could potentially adapt these strategies by investing in infrastructure like high-speed internet and modern schools, which would make rural living more appealing. With the right investments, these regions could transform into thriving communities again, offering young families an affordable, peaceful alternative to the crowded cities, all while contributing to reversing the demographic decline. However, financial incentives and social changes will only get Greece so far. Why? Because Greece's government knows with shame that these policies and social changes won't affect the underlying crisis. There has been another critical aspect of addressing Greece's demographic and economic challenges. It lies in how the country manages migration. Migration offers a chance to inject new energy into a shrinking and aging workforce. At least, that's what in theory should be. But practically and realistically speaking, migration to Greece? It's a mixed bag. On one hand, it's been framed as a crisis. But on the other, it might actually help solve the country's rapidly shrinking population. It's true that Greece hasn't always been a country that attracted foreigners. Back in the day, Greeks were the ones leaving, looking for better opportunities elsewhere. But that flipped in the 1990s, when migrants from places like Albania and Bulgaria started arriving after the Soviet bloc fell apart. Then came the 2015 refugee crisis, which brought over 1 million people fleeing wars in Syria, Afghanistan, and Iraq. Many of them got stuck in overcrowded camps on islands like Lesbos and in cities like Athens. Greece was already struggling economically after its financial meltdown, so the sudden influx really didn't help. A lot of Greeks see migration as more of a problem than a solution. And to be fair, it has caused issues. Social services, housing, and local communities were overwhelmed. This also fueled the rise of far-right politics. But in the bigger picture of the demographic crisis, migration might be the last resort. Migrants tend to be younger than the local population, and often take jobs in sectors like agriculture, construction, and domestic care, industries that Greece literally can't survive without. Without these workers, parts of the economy would collapse. The problem is integration, or rather the lack of it. Right now, migrants face tons of barriers. They don't speak the language, don't have many resources, and are struggling to find good jobs. Greece doesn't exactly make it easy either. There aren't enough programs for language training, vocational skills, or affordable housing. If migrants can't find a way into the system, they stay marginalized, which creates tensions and waste potential. And there's another problem. Many migrants don't see Greece as a place to settle. It's more of a pit stop on their way to countries like Germany or Sweden, where opportunities and social benefits are better. That leaves Greece stuck footing the bill for housing, healthcare, and education without reaping the long-term benefits. To change that, Greece needs to make itself more appealing. Loosening its strict citizenship rules could help, especially for skilled migrants or those with strong ties to the community. Migration could also help with Greece's low birth rate. Immigrant families tend to have more children, which could stabilize the population. Germany is already seeing this, and Greece could too, if it shifts its mindset and starts viewing migration as a chance to fix some of its biggest challenges. But all in all, Greece's future seems, frankly, pessimistic with all the big challenges. But with real opportunities, Greece may turn things around in the hope for a brighter future. The question is, can Greece make it happen? Now, before we get into that, I wanted to quickly answer a recent question that got asked. A lot of you guys want to start a YouTube channel, but you are camera shy or you're just not comfortable with putting your face out there. In fact, I'm one of those people, and that's why this channel has no face on it. Luckily, you can still grow on YouTube even without showing your face or giving up your privacy. This channel is living proof of that. In fact, here are just a few examples of channels that started in the last 12 months and grew an audience without showing their face. They have gotten millions of views and made thousands of dollars from them. Now, we recently crossed 1.5 million subscribers, and along the way, we've learned a few tips and tricks about YouTube that could be helpful for any of you that want to start your own channel. We've included all of this in my completely free 7-day YouTube Crash Bootcamp. So, if you're someone who's interested in starting a YouTube channel, this is the perfect starting point for you. So, if you are interested in signing up, you can sign up for free now by clicking on the link in the description or by scanning the QR code on the screen.